Just need to know for minutes.
At 7:31, I call this meeting to order. I'll now be taking the roll. I am present. Senator Forbes. Here. Vice Chair McClanahan.
Here.
Senator Leonard.
Here.
And Senator Alexander. Senator Alexander is not here. Okay, let's move into our agenda. Is there anyone here for public comment? All right, seeing none, the floor is now closed for public comment. As you all can see, we have three main agenda items tonight. First is testimony from Mr. Christopher Everett, the president of the student body and former chair of the Senate Finance Committee. Second on our agenda is testimony from Mr. Aidan Blevins, former Richards administration staffer. And the third is testimony from Mr. Logan Grodsky. President Everett was summoned to be here at 7:30 p.m. See, he has not yet arrived here at the committee. Perhaps we can give him some additional time, about maybe 2 minutes, but if at that point he still does not show up, we should perhaps consider reordering the agenda to hear from witnesses who are present with us right now. Mr. Blevins will be joining us at 7:45 p.m. For his testimony. So we'll wait until 7:35 to see if the president shows up.
Mr. Ertl, are you recording?
The meeting is being recorded. I
Thank
think
you.
we'll wait a couple more minutes. At this point, do I hear a motion to reorder the agenda to move the testimony of, oh, actually, hold on. President Everett, are you able to hear us? Right, am I muted?
Yes, can you hear me? I'm sorry. I had the wrong link. Can y'all hear me?
Yes,
Yep,
awesome.
yep.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, sorry, I was on the wrong link.
All right. Well, okay, so we will not have to reorder the agenda. But well, let's move into our questioning period. So before we start, all witnesses are reminded that testimony given to the Undergraduate Senate or any of its committees must be truthful according to the laws of the student body and the instrument of student judicial governance. And with that, for the record, could you please state your full name?
Yes, Christopher Everett.
Could you please confirm that you served as chair of the Finance Committee of the 103rd Undergraduate Senate?
Yes, I did briefly.
Um, during your tenure as chair, are you familiar with USB 103009, a bill to add branch budget proposals?
That was 2 years ago, so I'm not entirely aware of that bill. So no, I'm not.
Um, do you recall discussions of, well, any legislation that added branch budget proposals?
Again, I do not. That was so long ago, and I was served very briefly, so I do not recall those.
Um, are you aware that branch budgets were added under your tenure as chair of the Senate Finance Committee?
I was not. It was again 2 years ago. I do not know. Can you re-explain that for me? Because I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to.
Certainly. So the branch budget, so USB 103009 was a bill that created a funding cycle during the summer session that would allow the executive branch as well as other branches of student government to apply for funding without having to go through the regular budget cycle. Does this ring any bells by any chance?
Yeah, I do. Yes, that reminds me. I do not remember that bill coming through my, I guess, committee, but all the directions I took from finance chair came directly from Speaker Powell and also former undergraduate treasurer Asta Shokla, because I was transitioning to that role early on in the summer. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Do you recall if you had any discussions regarding this branch budget system and specifically this bill with President Richards at the time or the student government advisor, Bobby Kuntzman? Yes.
Not at all. Especially at the time, we did not have any close relationships. So any communication that happened I'm sure they came through the Senate, involved everyone. So no, I did not have any conversations of that sort.
Okay. Um, During your chairmanship of the Finance Committee, do you recall the consideration of USB 103009? And do you recall if there was any debate over the piece of legislation while you were chair?
I do not. I do not. But if it was passed, I know the entire Senate voted on that, so it was not directly myself. So I do not. I'm so sorry.
Do you recall if there was any debate on USB 103009 or the bill on the branch budget proposals in the full Senate?
I do not. And is this about the branch budget proposals that we just spoke about for the summer
Yes.
allocations? Oh
Yes.
no, I do not. I was a new senator, so I do not have that recollection.
Um, do you recall how you, being the chair of the Finance Committee, voted on this bill in the full Senate?
I do not, but that should be accessible in the 103rd, I believe, Senate. I'm sure the drive should still be available to Speaker Gary or some other or per tempore hurdles. I do not have that information, but it should be accessible because everything should have been kept by Speaker Powell.
Okay. Um, would you consider today, if you were an undergraduate senator, to vote for this bill today or a bill creating branch budget proposals over the summer?
I would rather not answer a hypothetical question of that sort. I think it would have to be a case by case basis, just in looking at the processes. And I'm not as familiar with if any processes have changed since I was there very briefly 2 years ago.
So, I guess, are you, could you speak whether you would be in favor of branch budget allocations similar to the manner that was voted on during your chairmanship of the Finance Committee? Would you consider supporting a bill in that nature today?
I don't believe I have the proper information to make a well advised decision. So I think I will just abstain from that vote and also probably from this question in general. I don't want to murky the waters there.
Um, do you recall if you had any discussions with President Richards, organizational treasurer Isles, or undergraduate student body treasurer Shukla at the time regarding the undergraduate executive branch budget request?
I did not. I'm sure if President Richards came before the Finance Committee, came before the committee as a whole, there were no outside conversations, and all the conversations were documented again in all Senate meetings, and it should be in the 103rd drive, I believe, as well.
Do you recall the discussion or debate that the Finance Committee had regarding the undergraduate executive branch budget request?
I do recall the committee as a whole and the Senate as a whole making some changes to the original budget request. But more specifically than that, I do not. But I know that the committee and the Senate as a whole took a very impartialized approach and wanted to make sure that we were allocating funds equitably to all organizations.
Do you recall the changes that were made either in committee or before the full Senate to the executive branch's budget request?
I do not, but that should all be publicly accessible as well in the Google Drive.
Okay. Could you please describe in detail how the Finance Committee applied the viewpoint neutral criteria found in the undergraduate code and federal law to justify the appropriation of funds to the executive branch and specifically to the REAL program?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was that viewpoint neutrality a recent addition with the last general cycle past spring, correct? I mean, that's just go ahead.
Viewpoint neutrality has been a part of federal law since a Supreme Court case in the 90s.
Great. Yeah, so at the time, again, for any decisions were made by the committee, I'll share this information. In terms of the committee as a whole, again, I was chair very, very briefly, but our committee was run as just more panelized, I would say. I think my role at the time more so was just kind of set the meetings and have some clarity to things. But no, yeah, I can't recall that specific information. But again, any decisions that were made were by the entire committee as a whole and then by the entire Senate. So
And as one final question, do you recall any discussion that you may have had with President Richards, Director of Programming Austin Greer, Treasurer Isles, or Treasurer Shukla regarding the Richard Epps Emerging Leaders Program?
no, I was there very briefly and I didn't have any personalized relationships with them other than Treasurer Shukla just getting the reins of the ropes of the job, but no specifics about any budget requests or proposal or anything like that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Do any of the other committee members have any questions for President Everett? All right. Well, those are all of the questions I have. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you for joining us. If there are no other questions, I think we can move on to
I have
our
a
next
quick
witness. I'm sorry, the public comment period was.
I'm actually
at
acting
the
as
be-
counsel for President Everett.
I don't know if this would be in order. Could the R&J chair provide any insight on that?
Let me check the rules. It would depend on the sort of question that you would be asking.
Could you speak on the nature of your question?
Yes, I was just going to request that this recording be sent after this is over.
It most certainly will.
Okay.
The video is being recorded. Minutes are being taken. They will be published on the Senate website and be publicly accessible.
Perfect.
Well, thank you all for your leadership as well. I'm wishing you all the best. I hope you have a great day.
Yes, thank you for your time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, y'all. See you soon.
All right. Well, it appears that our next witness, Mr. Blevins, has not yet arrived.
Mr. Blevins has indicated to me that he is currently in the Zoom waiting room.
Oh, all right. Okay. I don't see him in the waiting room. I don't believe there is a waiting room.
Is he on the correct Zoom link?
Yeah, I don't know if he's in the right Zoom meeting. I can send him. Let's see if I can get the Zoom link.
Mr. Blevins believes he received the wrong link. I've sent him the correct one.
Awesome. Thank you. Mr. Blevins, thank you for joining us. Are you able to hear us?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well then let's get started. For the record, could you please state your full name?
Yes, Aidan Michael Blevins.
And could you state what position or positions you held within the Richards administration?
Yes, I was with varied titles because Lamar did a few restructures at the beginning. I worked in the Department of Programs and Policy Implementation. So there were like 3 consultants, associates that were assigned to his various projects, and I was on the Richard Epps Emerging Leaders program.
So, could you state at what point in time and under what circumstances did you become involved with the REAL program?
Yeah, so I was involved without well, in the program from, so we got assigned our roles beforehand, before like the school year really commenced, and then we had our like orientation for the entire executive branch in, I think it was late August. At that point, we then had a meeting in Lamar's office in the student government suite, at which he assigned, there are 3 of us that worked in his department. He assigned each of us to, or there might have been 4, but he assigned each of us to one of his programs or policies that he was working on. And I got assigned to Richard Epps Emerging Leaders program in September. And I worked on that program until the end of his administration, at which it was turned over to Elijah.
Could you speak as to what your responsibilities were in respect to the REAL program?
Yes, so I would say that my responsibilities were to assist in the development of the supposed curriculum of the program. So that involved like developing presentations for the program, developing the content in terms of the topics, and developing like an overall strategy for that. Now, whether those obligations and responsibilities were carried through or like actually, held out, it's a different question, but those were my general responsibilities. And then also just managing relationships with the scholars themselves and university admin, and generally being a representative or point person for programs and policies for the administration.
Okay. So I guess could you elaborate a bit on the events and components? So to the best of your knowledge, how many events and components did the REAL program purport to have to its participants? And could you elaborate on the nature of those events and components?
Yeah, so to mind, this is like 2 years ago, so I might be a little bit off, but I remember it generally. So we had one event. Well, we had, yeah, so starting this school year, we had like a general, like little like cocktail orientation kind of thing, like no drinks involved, but like just like a nice little lunch. And then like Kevin Guskiewicz, chancellor, was there, did some remarks, and people just, had some drinks, non-alcoholic, and then ate, and then there were a few speakers. So we had something like that just to introduce people to the program. And then after that, I believe it started in September, we had one event that was in Carolina Hall, where I was actually pretty surprised by how well structured it was. Austin Gear put that together, and he was the director of that department at that time, under Lamar. So there was that, and that had a curriculum. I wouldn't say it was part of the curriculum necessarily, but it was more of like sort of an introduction thing where we did various leadership icebreakers. I know that we had a few events on Zoom. And I guess I can describe one of those. There were several like leaders within the university that were invited to that meeting, and Austin didn't show up to the meeting for 45 minutes and requested that I canceled it. I said no, and just carried out the meeting myself. So there was that. And then I think there was one other instance where Austin brought in a vice provost or some high level administrator that talked about leadership and developing your resume and networking with people. And then in the spring, I don't think that there was any actual like real, no pun intended, like programming in the spring besides the retreat that happened in, I believe it was late March, early April. So that's to the best of my memory. what actually happened that school year.
Could you please state for the record again who Austin Greer was, who you mentioned, and what their capacity was in the real program?
Yeah, so Austin Gear was Director of Programs and Policy Implementation in the Richard administration. It was a position that was created under Lamar, that was in the office or the executive office of the president. And it was the only director position that was in that office. So I don't know, it was a little bit bizarre, but so that was his capacity, and I think he did like a few other little things. There was a little bit of like a personal relationship between him and Lamar, well, more than a little bit, but yeah, that was like his official title within the administration.
So, in the answer to the question, well, the question before the previous question, could you be more precise in what the real program purported to include to its participants? What was essentially promised to incoming real scholars? What were they told the real program was going to provide to them?
Yeah, so it was promoted as a leadership development program, I would say, as a scholars program. It was supposedly, according to Lamar, backed by the chancellor, and that designation of being within the program and being a scholar was to be placed on the transcript of the students that were involved in the program. I don't know if that was officially like marketed or presented to the scholars themselves, but that was mentioned to me. And it was supposed to be a leadership development program for students from underrepresented backgrounds, and then just like some non-traditional backgrounds at the university as well, so transfer students. And then like underrepresented, races, nationalities, and then like, members of the LGBTQ plus community, so forth. And it was also supposed to be like a professional development thing as well, and on top of the like the leadership aspect on campus. So I know that Lamar mentioned very clearly to the scholars that they would all receive an internship opportunity or support for an internship opportunity by the end of the school year. I know that that was not carried out, and I think that there were several alternatives that were discussed for that commitment. I think that they did, like, there were discussions with Bobby. This is just to the best of my knowledge. I could be wrong about the exact details, but there were discussions about giving the students the stipends instead to help them support some kind of summer project or like unpaid internship or something like that. And there were also discussions with like public offices, so like with the state, to try and figure out if there were places that those students could get internships, and then also within the university as well. But I know that that obligation was not fulfilled.
So could you also speak on how many events were, do you recall, to the best of your recollection, how many events were promised throughout the semester? What was the frequency of that? Could you speak on that?
Yeah, so we actually were like working on developing a bi-weekly curriculum. So it's supposed to be like in alignment with that, a bi-weekly meeting basis for the program. I know that that's switched on and off between Zoom and in person just to accommodate for people's schedules. So that was supposed to be what it was. I remember there were, I think Lamar mentioned that in order for it to be considered a class or like an actual scholars program, there needed to be some kind of attendance mandate for the students. And then also like there were requirements on what exactly the curriculum breakdown needed to be in terms of topics. I can't remember what exactly the topics were, but it was supposed to be like a full scale like education module throughout the school year. But that didn't happen, if that makes sense.
And by that didn't happen, could you comment on the frequency at which it happened? How often did those meetings actually end up happening as compared to what was promised?
Yeah, I think as like one would predict with like a floundering program, to say the least, I think It happened pretty consistently in the beginning in the fall semester with the bi-weekly plan or curriculum, and then it started to taper off in terms of attendance and honestly in terms of commitment from Lamar and Austin. So I would say that for the first couple of weeks it happened pretty consistently, and then it tapered off in the fall semester, and then spring was just kind of a complete mess, to say the least. Like, I think that there were a few events that were planned on Zoom, but I can't recall if like any of those were executed. I know that the retreat was something that was discussed towards the beginning of the school year, but it was something that, in my opinion, was kind of haphazardly thrown together at the last minute. So that happened in, I think, the very last week of March and then the first week of April.
Okay. So would it be accurate to describe that most of the events that were promised did not end up coming into fruition?
Yes.
Okay. To your knowledge, did the leadership of the program fully intend to deliver all components throughout the lifetime of the Richards administration?
I think at the beginning it had very good intentions. I mean, I can't speak to what exactly the motivation was behind the program, whether it was vanity for, hosting this elaborate program and putting it together and successfully executing it, if that was the motivation behind it, or whether it was wholehearted. I have no idea. But I think that Lamar kind of realized, and maybe Austin too, that it was a very big commitment to execute a program like this. And so there was a team around it, like there were people there like me, but I was never personally asked to do anything beyond like, and I even volunteered myself to do stuff to help keep this thing alive. So I would say over time that promise or like that willingness to deliver diminished. But I think that if I had to be honest, I think that the intent, if I'm assuming that it was wholehearted and not malicious, then there was an intention at the beginning.
Do you recall as to when there seemed to be a change in intentions, perhaps, as you describe it?
I would say a few weeks into the program. I can't like pinpoint an exact date, maybe October, November. I think that the biweekly curriculum became a lot to handle, and Austin at the time, I believe he was a biochemistry major or like biostatistics, something like that here at UNC. He graduated alongside Lamar. And he was a research assistant at the time or doing some kind of research. And he also had several other commitments at the university. I think he was TAing as well. And I think that both of them, I think Austin first realized that it was a lot to execute something like that, and then just kind of discarded it. And then I think that over time, because Lamar had so many other commitments in his capacity as president, that he just kind of was like, okay, and just moved on to the next thing. So yeah, I would say a few weeks in.
Okay. So was the administration aware then that many components of the program, as promised to the real scholars, was not being carried out?
Yes.
And again, could you state when they became aware that those components were not being carried out?
I mean, I would say the first couple of weeks, again, in alignment with like the previous question. I mean, the meetings were just not happening. So I mean, I think that the commitment there, like, I mean, I can't say anything about them, executing and doing it successfully if there's nothing happening. So yeah, just kind of it died out like after the first couple of weeks again.
Did the administration take any steps to rectify this?
There were the discussions about with Bobby, if I recall, I think it was with Bobby, we had that discussion about substituting the internship commitment that occurred, I think earlier in the school year, with stipends for the students, in order to try and rectify the situation with them getting promised internships and then not happening. I know there's a lot of upsetness around that. So That was where most of the discussion was focused, but I don't think that like in terms of like the actual programming itself, I don't think that there was like any real commitment or intention or anything like that to try and rectify it.
Okay. Were there any plans to continue certain aspects of the real program, or to at least maintain some of the promises that were promised to the real scholars?
I mean, this is purely from my perspective, but it's a weird situation because I don't know all the details in terms of like all the different angles and like perspectives there are on the situation. I personally heard that going into the like van administration, which I also worked in, that Lamar was trying to keep a hold on the real program, and after that transition out, he was trying to maintain his capacity in leading that program. So I think that there was an intention there to carry it on. I think that Teddy or Talisha Van was not super invested in continuing real, but I think that she felt a need to because there were promises that were made that were not delivered. And I even think that in her administration, nothing went, nothing happened there as well with the program. So I think with Teddy, no, there was not like a real commitment to carry it over. But from my perspective of what I've heard, I think Lamar had some kind of interest or investment in trying to maintain it. So whether that's true or not, I have no idea, but that's what I heard.
Were there any conversations under the Van administration to continue real programming? And if so, were there any actions taken to continue programming, to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, so I worked as a senior advisor to student body Talisha Van, and we had several discussions about continuing the program. She actually appointed, I think his name is Tyler Clayton, to try and lead that program. And under her administration, I don't think that ever got off the ground because I personally volunteered myself to try and help rectify that and work with Tyler throughout the school year to revive the program and try and make it what it was supposed to be. But I think he sent an email to me asking if we could meet, and then I followed up and asked for his availability, and then the conversation just ended there. So it never, from my knowledge, it never went off the ground.
Okay. I guess jumping back to the cohort of real scholars under the Richards administration, to the best of your knowledge, how many of the real scholars were actually provided with an internship over the summer?
Through the program, none. I don't think any of them were.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, did the administration intend to provide real scholars with an internship?
It's a great question. If I had to speak honestly, I think it was a comment that was made by Lamar and a suggestion that was made that I think he thought that he could deliver on, but quickly realized that he couldn't. So I think that there was an intention there to do it, but I don't think that there was any real push or effort to actually deliver on that commitment.
When do you think the administration became aware that real scholars would not be provided with an internship over the summer?
I would say mid to late spring semester of, I think it was spring 2022.
Were there any efforts made? I believe you mentioned the stipend, but were there any efforts made by the administration to provide real scholars with an actual internship?
I think that I think Lamar had some connections within the university and like Bobby as well, who previously worked at the university. I think that they tried to pull some strings and see if there were opportunities available within the university, but I can say with confidence that within those opportunities, there were not enough for the number of scholars. So I think that they were trying to grab, whatever was available and whatever they could pull, but there was no real plan in place to deliver on that commitment.
And when were real scholars made aware that they would not be getting internships over the summer?
I don't think they were ever officially made aware that there was no statement or release or anything that I know of that was sent out that was saying like, hey guys, you're not gonna have internships. Like I don't think that was ever a conversation. I think it was just kind of inferred when the end of the school year came and nobody was actually delivered anything. And I think that I think what was the big nail in the coffin about the concerns about that was that there was a survey that was sent out. I don't know if the results are still existent, but they sent out a survey to the real participants at the end of the school year, and got feedback from them. And there was a lot of frustration and anger from participants about not getting internships. And they because I remember one in particular said that they delayed applying to internships and actually like going in and looking for like roles because they were promised this opportunity that they would have an internship provided to them. So they lost the opportunity to get that experience over the summer.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, to your knowledge, did President Richards ever travel out of state for official reasons related to the REAL program?
Yes.
What was the official purpose of this trip?
I was actually invited on that trip. There was one trip that was made to San Francisco, I believe. I think they went to it was Stanford. And Lamar arranged a meeting with like some senior admin at Stanford that was involved in diversity and inclusion or some kind of leadership capacity, inclusive leadership capacity at Stanford. And they were going to have a meeting there to talk about programming and how to, successfully go about, giving this program longevity and doing it right. I think it was over spring break, at which I was at home, so I didn't go. But I know that Austin and him went.
Okay. For the record, could you again, it was that Austin Gear?
Yes.
Okay. So did anyone else accompany President Richards on this trip?
I can't remember if Ananya, who is another member of the Department of Programs and Policy, who had like shifting roles, because now that I remember there were 4 of us and there were 3 programs. And I believe 2 of the other like people that were in the department were actually in the REAL program, so they couldn't work on it. So I think that she just got assigned to work on REAL. But Ananya was another person that worked on the program. I think she's since then graduated, but I can't remember if she went, but she might have. So 3 people.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, was the official purpose of this trip accomplished?
I think so. I think they had the meeting. I'm gonna be entirely honest. I think anything that I saw was them on top of like a roof at like a nice hotel. So that's all I got. I don't know if they actually had the meeting. I presume they did. But there was no like big or elaborate discussion about it like when they came back.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, during this trip, did President Richards engage in any activities that exceeded the core purposes of this trip?
Can you define what like would going and getting food or anything like that be included as something that was outside the scope of this trip?
No. Anything beyond reasonable expectations of daily life that would exceed the core purposes of the trip.
I don't know exactly what the timeline was and where they were supposed to be at certain times. I know that they did go and like explore the city. I don't know if that was like an off time or they they weren't just like staying at Stanford University the entire time. But I know that they like went out and got food and everything, which I personally feel is normal. I don't know what they spent or where they went. I just saw pictures. And I think that they like maybe in the off time went and explored. But yeah, it was like a 3-day trip, I think, 4-day, something like that.
To the best of your knowledge, were any official funds used for any activities that exceeded the core purposes of the trip?
I can't say with confidence because I wasn't like directly involved in the finances like being exchanged for that trip or like who was paying for it. But I think they probably used like the finances on like food and stuff, but I don't know exactly like to what extent, and whether it was like inappropriate usage of that money.
Do you think that money might have been used for anything beyond food or accommodations or meetings at Stanford?
I mean, there were I think they paid for the flights as well, so there's that. But I honestly can't say like whether they used it for like personal expenditures or anything like that in this case.
So having served as a senior advisor and a program specialist, you seem to be an expert on the executive branch. And in your capacity as an expert, do you believe that the executive branch has the capacity to execute a program on the scale of the real program?
I think with the right amount of people, maybe, but I think there should have been somebody, regardless of whether this program was being executed by students or officials at the university. I think that there should have been somebody who had a job or had a job that was working specifically on this program, or it was a component of their job at the university. I don't think that it should have been Lamar or Austin or myself leading this huge program with that much money backing it, and the chancellor, and this is alleged, I don't know if this is actually the case, but the chancellor putting his mark on the transcript and saying that this is a designated scholars program. So no, I don't think so.
Okay, so just again for the record, could you so you believe that the executive branch does not have the capacity to execute a program on the scale as it has been previously executed?
Alone or with like some kind of support?
As it was executed under the real program?
As in the state that it was when I was a part of the program, no. Definitely not like something that was feasible to be executed successfully or as it was planned initially.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think this committee should be made aware of?
I do think it was a little bit strange. Like I have a particular instance in mind that when we were planning the retreat for real, I do think that the money that was spent there was excessive. I know that the P card that was used for that, I don't know exactly how much the retreat cost like to the dime or anything, but I know there was several thousands of dollars. And I don't think it was like super productive in my opinion. So I think that was a bit excessive. I mean, we rented the entire campground and then got like catered food and like instructors to come in and do all this sort of stuff. And I don't feel like anything, maybe under different circumstances it would have made sense, but there wasn't even a follow-up discussion about like what they learned from this retreat. So I think that was a bit excessive. And I know that there was discussions about the money that was spent on that excursion being over the limit of the P card. So we had to like work with Bobby to cut things out and figure out like where things could be paid for without the P card. So there was that. And I don't know whether this was a part of real or like the money went there, but I think it's something worth noting. I do think it's a little bit bizarre that he said like with the NCAA tournament that was happening in New Orleans that school year, he said that the chancellor sent him 2 cars to go down to New Orleans. I don't know a reason why the chancellor would do that. Just send like Lamar and like his friends to New Orleans on a trip like that. So I don't know whether that money came from real, but I think it's something worth noting and looking into. But those two things are just things I would know as you explore that. But I don't know what like the end of result of that would be for that kind of investigation.
The retreat you mentioned was when was that held?
I can actually check.
And
Just
that
like-
was as a part of the real program.
Yes, that was funded by money that was allotted to real. Sorry?
And that was the one retreat that was held under the real program.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me see here so I can just give you exact dates. This was, drum roll, please. No. Let's see here. Okay, this was from the earliest time that I can see this. This was from March 30th, 2022 to April 1st, 2022. So I think we stayed there 2 nights and then came back on the 1st.
Okay. Who were all or most of the real scholars present at that event?
I would say half.
Could you comment on what activities were held there?
We went to, they had an on-site petting zoo, so that there was that. So we went and pet animals. We went on like a walk with like a professional that was like, it was like a team bonding thing. We went on a walk through like nature. I know that they did like a mindfulness exercise at one point. I was working on stuff, so I wasn't like directly involved in like doing the activity. There was a professional that was doing that. I know that there were like some mini activities or like relating to leadership, but nothing like super organized or cohesive. We also went to App State, at which we were supposed to be meeting the student body president and several members of that administration, but I think that they ended up being busy during that time, so we ended up just going to Boone and like walking around at App State. So there was that. There was also a movie night, which I don't know how that was super relevant, but that happened. Trying to think if there was anything else. There were several like on-site like meals and stuff, but I think that's really all I can attest to.
Okay. And again, was this retreat was promised in the real program from the onset to its participants? Is that accurate?
No.
When did the idea for this retreat, I guess, come up?
Spring semester. I can't say exactly when. I believe it was spring semester, might have been late fall, but I think the actual planning of it started in February or maybe early March. But I could be incorrect about that.
So then would it be accurate to say that by the time this retreat was being planned, that many aspects of the real program, which had originally been promised to real scholars, were no longer being fulfilled?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have any recollection of the amount of funds that were spent on this retreat?
I think the limit on the P card was 5,000, and I think it exceeded that. They might have cut it short of that, because I know that Bobby Kuntzman that worked in, I think it was student life and leadership, during that school year, We were on a call with him in Lamar's office, and he said that it was exceeding the P card capacity. I don't know exactly what that number was, but it was definitely in the thousands of dollars.
All right, well, thank you for that. Those are all the questions that I have. Do any other senators of the committee have questions? And I yield to Senator Forbes.
Yes. Okay. So going back a bit to that Stanford trip, earlier tonight, you did mention how in planning for the real programming, a mix of both in-person and Zoom events was discussed to accommodate the schedules of everyone. To your understanding, why did former President Richards not consider holding the meetings that occurred in Stanford over Zoom?
This is just speaking from personal opinion, but I personally, just from my experience with Lamar, and this is not to like slander him in any way, this is just my personal opinion. I do feel like it was something that was more interesting for him in his personal capacity as an aspiring university administrator or a leader in some kind of organization to meet with those representatives, because I don't recall that being a discussion about involving students in that conversation, or even that being something that was planned where there was a consideration for students coming. And I don't think that it was a discussion where there was like, oh, this is the purpose behind why we're going on this trip, and this is how it's going to contribute to real. It just kind of felt like a thing of like, oh, I have this opportunity to speak with, or not I, but we have the opportunity to speak with this administrator. Let's go. And then it felt like the program was a little bit of an afterthought in that conversation. But then again, I'm not Lamar, so I can't speak on what exactly his intentions were. That was just my perspective.
Senator Forbes, do you have any further questions?
No, that is all.
All right. Do any other senators of the committee have questions for Mr. Blevins? Excuse me. Okay. Seeing none, Mr. Blevins, we really appreciate your testimony tonight. Thank you for your time. Thank you for spending your Wednesday evening with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. See you later.
With that, we'll move on to testimony from our third witness, Mr. Logan Grodsky, the undergraduate student body treasurer and former member of the Senate Finance Committee. Mr. Grodsky, for the record, could you please state your full name?
Logan Hunter Grodsky.
And at the time of the Richards administration, what capacities did you serve in the undergraduate student government?
I served as a member of the undergraduate Senate beginning, I want to say, in late October. I served further as a member of the Undergraduate Senate Finance Committee throughout that time. I also served as, I will say, a member and the chair of a Senate Select Committee to investigate the Board of Elections.
During your time as a member of the Undergraduate Senate and as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, do you recall any requests made by Finance Committee Chair Andrew Richards of the Lamar Richards administration of financial information?
I do. It is my recollection that in early February of 2022, which was the spring semester of the 2021-2022 school year, obviously, a request was transmitted to the executive branch organizational treasurer, and I believe the wording of that was for all financial records maintained by the executive branch at that time.
To the best of your knowledge, for what purpose were these requests made by Chair Richards?
It is my understanding, and this is per conversations with Andrew Richards. He stated that he had come to believe that significant portions of executive branch programming that had been funded by the undergraduate senate was not being carried out, and wanted documentation to elucidate that matter.
To the best of your knowledge, to the best of your recollection, how did the executive branch respond to those requests made by Chair Richards?
Could you say that once again?
To the best of your recollection, how did the executive branch respond to those requests made by Chair Richards?
This is further documented in an email that I provided to the chair of the committee, I believe yesterday evening, but there was a significant delay, I believe, of many weeks before the finance committee received any form of records from the Richards administration. After some back and forth, I believe, mostly with President Richards promised the finance committee chair at the time that the records would be provided promptly. I want to say that this was at the end of February. Again, I'm not sure about that, and I would encourage you to reference the contemporaneous emails which I provided to the committee for the record. At that point, it's not clear whether the incumbent organizational treasurer resigned or was dismissed, but a new person was appointed as acting organizational treasurer. This person provided a very brief overview of the financial records of the undergraduate executive branch. I recall, and again, this was provided to the finance committee of which I was a member. I recall this being very brief. I want to say it was 2 pages, and did not contain significant financial data relating to the executive branch. In response to this, and I believe this fell on the evening of an undergraduate senate meeting, in response to this, the undergraduate senate considered and adopted a bill ordering the undergraduate student government treasurer at the time, which was Ashna Shukla, to freeze the executive branch's funding. That's to say, to cause reimbursements to the executive branch for funding to cease until such time as the Senate authorized it to continue, pending the receipt of a full record of transactions. During this time, shortly after this, there was some back and forth. I don't precisely recall the circumstances, but I did have one meeting with President Richards and his office in the student government suite. And he claimed that he was unsure of what was being requested of the executive branch, given that it was vague in his words. I expressed anything resembling a transaction sheet or a ledger, or a balance sheet, anything, which would give an overview of what the executive branch had spent money on, how much money they had remaining. I believe this was eventually provided to the finance committee. And it revealed that very little, if any, of their Senate appropriated funds had been spent to that time. I tried to find that file, which I believe is a digital online Google file. And I found the email where it was provided to the Senate committee, but it appears that file has since been deleted.
So, based on what I understand from what you just stated, would it be accurate to describe that the executive branch did not fully comply with the requests of Finance Chair Richards?
Yes.
To the best of your understanding, why did the executive branch not fully comply with the requests of Chair Richards?
I can't state with confidence any particular reason. I will say that it is my understanding that the administration's communication with the organizational treasurer had essentially dissolved by that time. It is also my understanding that the financial records that they provided to us had not been consistently kept to that time, and that it required quite a bit of work to get those into order. These have been stated to me. I don't know these. I don't know these for a fact. I'm not a firsthand party to any of that.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by the communications had essentially dissolved between the administration and the organizational treasurer of the administration?
It is my understanding that they were not in any communication.
Well, at that point, are you aware of who was running the executive branch's finances at that time?
There was a person, and they're, I believe, included on some of the emails that I provided to the committee. I don't recall their last name, but I believe their first name was Noel. And they were some sort of deputy to the organizational treasurer. And they were tasked with responding to the Senate's request for records. That being said, it does not appear that the executive branch was making any significant financial transactions that would have required the oversight of the organizational treasurer. Those transactions, which did occur, seem to have been directly compelled from the Carolina Union.
Okay.
Executed by the Carolina Union at the president's request.
And well, in your capacity as an expert on student government finances, do you believe that the executive branch has the capacity to execute a program on the scale of the real program?
What I will comment is that historically, the great majority of funds which have been appropriated to the executive branch, and this includes, I have been responsible as treasurer for fiscal years, including both the Richards administration, the Van administration, and now the Everett administration. And I won't speak to anything related to the Everett administration, which is entirely ongoing. They've not yet had funds appropriated to them. But in terms of the Van administration and the Richards administration, the overwhelming majority of funds appropriated to them were never spent. Most of those funds were directed towards much smaller programmatic efforts, which did not occur, or which did not require funding. As a member of the executive board, I have seen a number of programs be proposed and not be brought to take into fruition. In my opinion, and I state this again in a capacity as a observer of the undergraduate student government, and not in any formal advisory capacity in my related to my position as treasurer. The executive branch is not historically successful at conducting programming.
Thank you for your testimony. That is all the questions that I have. Do any of the other senators on the committee have questions for Treasurer Grodsky? Seeing none, well, I guess if I could ask one final question. Treasurer Grodsky, do you believe that there is any additional information that this committee should be made aware of?
There's documentation which I believe I possess related to the executive branch, and the subject matter of the committee. I would be happy to provide that to the committee, though it was not specifically requested.
That would be greatly appreciated if you could send those documents in and submit them
Yes.
to the record of this committee.
I'm happy to do that.
Seeing no further questions, Mr. Grodsky, we thank you for your time. Thank you for being here with us this evening. I shall now move into notices and announcements. I will be sending out the additional documents that have been added to the record to the members of the committee, and these will be available on the Senate Drive. If anyone has any questions, feel free to send me an email. At this point, we do not have our next meeting scheduled yet, but I will be sending out information regarding that. In the meantime, please review the testimony we've heard tonight, and please be sure to look over the documents that are in the record. Seeing no further business, this committee stands adjourned.